for him now. I look a little better. Let's do the opposite. I didn't want the army stuff. So the batteries will be in here. Come on. So I looked up and I saw black on your screen. I'm like, holy cow, did he just pass out?
Oh, don't say that, please.
I didn't see anything.
Did he send us the Atlantic article he was talking about? Oh.
I haven't sent it yet. It's in the packet of articles that I'll be sending out this weekend. All right, we're starting up in just a minute.
It doesn't pull all the way off once you unscrew it. It only pulls off that far. We found that out when somebody super strong tried that and pulled the antenna right off with it.
All right, we good to go? All right. Cool. All right, we're going to get started now.
Morning.
So, welcome everyone. Hope you're doing well. Lots in the news today and lots to cover. Welcome to the WUSA audience and everyone listening in. Appreciate you being here. And so, let us get started at this very critical moment in time, or as I will show you in just a sec. Let's do that. There are 40 days till Election Day. So give me a sec, I need to record. All right, everyone, 40 days to Election Day, and we are literally in the thick of a historic election, and there was, in September, an October surprise, and it was a surprise filled with poignancy and sadness because it was the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a legendary justice who had defied the odds all of her life, a woman who went into a male-dominated legal culture, a Jewish woman who could never get hired because of her gender and her religion at the top-tier law firms in the United States, somebody who then made a necessity into a virtue by using her voice and her legal expertise to change the law and to fight against forms of gender injustice and inequality that really and literally transform the law in the United States. But it wasn't long before Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away that all of a sudden it became a political topic. So I'm going to run a few videos for you, and you've seen these videos because some of you covered them in class yesterday. But here we are, and here is Mitch McConnell. This is in 2016, and here's what he had to say on Meet the Press.
The principle involved here, Chuck, when an election's underway, as Joe Biden was talking in 1992, when an election's underway, the American people are about to weigh in on who's going to be the president. And that's the person, whoever that may be, who ought to be making this appointment.
So there's Mitch McConnell. The principle involved is the people of the United States need to weigh in and decide who should be the president to nominate somebody for the Supreme Court. Here is Lindsey Graham, who is now the chair of the Judiciary Committee, which, as they decided yesterday, will be holding hearings in the middle of October with the goal of confirming somebody in almost record time by around Halloween. Here's Lindsey Graham.
I want you to use my words against me. If there's a Republican president in 2016 and a vacancy occurs in the last year of the first term, you can say, Lindsey Graham said, let's let the next president, whoever it might be, make that nomination, and you could use my words against me and you'd be absolutely right. We're setting a precedent here today, Republicans are.
And then Lindsey Graham has said that one of the reasons why he changed his mind this time around is because of the treatment of Justice Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearings. Yet, 2 years ago, Lindsey Graham said this at an Atlantic festival, which was only days before Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed. He had already made it out of the Judiciary Committee, and here's what he said at that time, even after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Judge Scalia dies in 2016. The primary process is ongoing. And if you look back in 100 years, nobody has been replaced under that circumstance. If you listen to what Joe Biden said in Bush 41, you should hold it over to the next election. Joe is right a lot. So I felt like I was doing the traditional thing there. When it came to Sotomayor and Kagan, I thought I did the traditional thing. Now I'll tell you this. This may make you feel better, but I really don't care. If an opening comes in the last year of President Trump's term and the primary process is started, we'll wait for the next election. And I've got a pretty good chance. You're on the record. Yeah, all right. Hold the tape.
All right, so there he was, again, talking about principle. And here was the former chair of the Judiciary Committee in 2016, Chuck Grassley, who has now again decided to go and confirm President Trump's justice.
People deserve to be heard, and they should be allowed to decide through their vote for the next president the type of person that should be on the Supreme Court. This is a reasonable approach. It is a fair approach. And it is a historical approach.
Reasonable, fair, historical. Even the president, current president, when he was a candidate, said this in 2016 to CNN.
Because I think the next president should make the pick, and I think they shouldn't go forward, and I believe I'm, pretty much in line with what the Republicans are saying. I think that the next president should make the pick. We don't have a very long distance to wait. Certainly they could wait it out very easily, but I think the next president should make the pick. I would be not in favor of going forward.
Well, Mitch McConnell gave a wink and a nod last year to everybody that it didn't matter what he said in 2016, this is what he was going to do. He said this a year ago.
If the Supreme Court justice was denied next year, what would you do?
We'd fill it.
It was amusing to him that he would do that, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Joe Biden responded and said, follow your conscience.
Look, I'm not being naive. I'm not speaking to President Trump, who'll do whatever he wants. I'm not speaking to Mitch McConnell, who'll do what he wants, and he does. I'm speaking to those Republicans out there, Senate Republicans, who know deep down what is right for the country and consistent with the Constitution, as I stand here in the Constitution Center. Not just what's best for their party. So I appeal to those few Senate Republicans, the handful who really will decide what happens. Please follow your conscience. Don't vote to confirm anyone nominated under the circumstances President Trump and Senator McConnell have created. Don't go there. Uphold your constitutional duty, your conscience.
Well, everyone, we know now that what Joe Biden said was not necessarily relevant, that Mitch McConnell was determined to do whatever he wants. What's your take on all of this? Is this, can we trust politicians when they talk about principle to mean it, or is principle, when they talk about it, just a fig leaf for exercising power in so many ways? So I see Zach and Anya and Andrea and Ryan to start. So why don't you all kick it off?
Yeah, I think that right now Republicans are kind of in a huge damage control situation because of how much people are pointing out the hypocrisy. However, I think that it's a lesson for the American people that although our judicial system was supposed to operate devoid of political influence, that the process is still determined by those who are directly a part of the political process. So, of course, no matter where we end up in this situation, Republicans are going to do what Republicans are going to want to do, and Democrats are just going to have to follow the playbook, which means that come November, if Donald Biden isn't adamantly campaigning on the fact that he is going to do something about the situation that Republicans have made, then Democrats are going to start seeing Biden as weak and not as in tune with what people are really saying. And I'm especially interested to see how this impacts states like North Carolina, Arizona, and Maine, all states that said that the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh sent worry among Democratic voters. So I think that however this plays out, it's definitely going to be a much longer term political battle rather than just something that we see impacting this election.
So this is going to spill over for a long, long time. That's what you're saying, and this is going to have consequences in the long term. Okay, so who was next there? Anya, and then Andrea and Ryan.
I was going to say that it's not surprising to me that Republicans said these things years ago that directly contradict what they're preaching today. I mean, to be fair, this happens on both sides depending on the situation, so I don't think it's just like a Republican issue. It can happen with Democrats as well. They have more of a real-time approach. So before they were saying things that would benefit them then, and now they're saying things that would benefit them now that it's relevant, because I think none of them thought that this would actually happen. So they were kind of playing the safe game before and saying what they needed to say. But now that it's happening, I mean, it's better for them to go along with what is more applicable now rather than live by their words, the ones that they said before. So yes, they're going to be called hypocrites, but at the end of the day, the decision is still up to Trump, so it doesn't really matter how they're acting right now. Most likely, I think the seat's going to be filled, because why wouldn't they? So it's, yeah, it's interesting that it's really a side of hypocrisy that we're seeing, but it doesn't really matter, I guess.
So that's sort of a sad statement. The hypocrisy doesn't really matter in our politics. Two other points. Yes, the president has every right to be able to nominate somebody the way President Obama did. But with the separation of powers, it then becomes up to the Senate. In this case, the Senate in 2016 refused to go ahead with President Obama's nomination, but the Senate in 2020 is going ahead with President Trump's. And they can use all of the rationalizations and justifications and excuses they want, but let's be clear about it. They are flip-flopping on this particular issue. Now, as you said, the Republicans will argue that the Democrats did stuff that's similar. They were not sort of pushing through George W. Bush's nominees to the lower courts for years, and they were filibustering, and there was a deal that was struck to be able to make sure that Bush's nominees could go through. And then when President Obama was in office, the Republicans were filibustering a lot of the president's nominees to the lower courts. So the Democrats ended the filibuster for lower courts and reduced that to just a majority vote. And at which point the Republicans will say, you were the ones who set the precedent, and we are now following through by reducing it to just a majority vote and no filibuster on a Supreme Court nomination. Because before, you needed to have those 60 votes to be able to push somebody through for the Supreme Court. So what you're arguing is that both sides do it, okay? But the question here is not just that both sides do it, but you have people on record talking about principle, and what does principle mean in politics?
I just
I really think that this is an obstruction of justice, quite literally. And to view it as politicized as it is, I think it's very disappointing knowing that we are needing someone to fill the place for the highest court of the land, and it's supposed to be devoid of all political affiliations, and to see how much this has influenced policy, or will have an influence on policy, and how much politics has influenced it now, and the hypocrisy of our political parties. It's just so deeply saddening to see that this is the state that America is in, that we can't even come to a proper, educated, formal conclusion to who should decide on a justice, which again should not be a political issue, but rather something that should just be based on merit, because this is a position that should not be influenced by politics, and yet we see that it is constantly and consistently has been, is, and will be influenced by politics. And I think that that is something that is extremely sad and flawed in our democracy.
And it's not just politics, it's the association of politics with power, because an appointment to the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment that can have an impact on jurisprudence, not just in the immediate years that can be checked by an election, but for decades to come. As I talked about yesterday, all the way up through the time that you retire, we will be seeing the consequences of these changes in the court and its effect and impact on jurisprudence. So yes, it's not just politics, it's power. Now, keep in mind that this is not something in recent years. In 1968, Richard Nixon, to be able to gain support from the segregationist senators in the South, promised them that he would put on the Supreme Court somebody who was not necessarily going to go fast on racial integration. And he basically said he's going to put some people on the court for whom integration and those issues related to it are going to be lower priorities. And so this goes back for many, many, many years. The difference, of course, is that with life expectancy growing, you can have somebody appointed in their mid-40s who will serve for 4 decades. When the concept of a lifetime appointment, when our Constitution was created, was people did not have the same life expectancy, and I don't think that they were expecting people to serve on the court for this many years. But this will affect all of you for years to come. So Ryan, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, so I just want to say, in regards to principle in politics, I think a lot of, I guess for those like abstract kind of concepts, a lot rests on like the individuals like in play during these like historical scenarios. I think that looking at McConnell and Trump in particular, like you haven't really had a majority leader and a president rely so much on, I guess in their like minds, like packing the judicial system with judges and having that be so important to their like electoral futures. And I think that it plays a pretty major role in why they are going through with this nomination. Whereas if someone else was in charge, maybe they would have been more, I guess, vulnerable to like, being shamed, or the, hypocrisy statements might have impacted them more.
So, can I weigh in here?
Yes, of course, Bruce. Bruce, you're not on camera.
I think this is a great dose of reality. For young people, old people, people who want to argue principle, in politics. None of us are surprised by this move. Are you kidding me? President may feel on the ropes. This is a great political opportunity for him. A game changer. He's hoping. You've got a conservative, Roman Catholic, woman on the one hand, you've got a Hispanic woman on the other hand. He's, touting these two as his top picks, could help him in Florida, could help him with the evangelical vote, that sort of thing. It's just a natural move for him. Shouldn't be surprised by it. I like what Nancy Pelosi said, and I think she is perhaps the most astute Democratic politician out there today. She doesn't argue as much that, well, they shouldn't do it, it's a matter of principle. That's a given. They've gone back on their word. Nobody, and Republicans aren't apologizing for that. This is like a gift that was laid in their laps. But she talks to her constituents about are the consequences of this kind of move. She says Obamacare could be dismantled. She says Roe versus Wade could be dismantled. The important things that will drive home some feeling from her constituents. I think that plays better for Democrats. I think to keep harping over, they're going back on their word, they lied or whatever, I just don't think it works. I think that's done. Those votes are already baked in. The other thing I'll just point out, and this is really interesting, I heard a top Republican make this argument, and he says they use this in approaching Mitt Romney and some others who are on the fence about all this. He says, if you look throughout history, whenever the president and the Senate majority are of the same party, they always went ahead, even in an election year, except for one time, and nominated and appointed or voted for the Supreme Court justice. That would be really interesting to look up. So in other words, they found some wiggle room here. You know, Obama was Democrat, we had a Republican Senate majority. Bottom line, elections have consequences. You know, you guys lost the election, we won Senate, President, White House, this is what we're going to do. So Democrats, get your constituency, get your people, get the independents to the polls if you want to change this and make sure it doesn't happen again.
So I think Bruce raises an interesting point, and I want to get into the politics of this for a second, but let's just touch on this one more time about principle. Because if politics is only about power, okay, and it's not about principle, will that turn off an entire generation of people who say, I don't want to sort of get in the mud and deal with these sort of power games, because the reason I want to go into politics is because of the things that I care about. And if principle doesn't matter in politics, is that something that could be very, very toxic in our culture and for our future? Then I want to get into the politics of all of this, and then to follow up on Bruce, I want to get into all the issues that Bruce was talking about Nancy Pelosi saying. So we're going to go across my board here, and we're going to go with the following. Remember this: Maddie, Andriana, Chloe, Dan, Simona, and Manuel. If you guys can remember that, please help me out. All right, go for it.
Yeah, I think interestingly enough, this decision and sort of this fight for power in itself is ultimately a question of principle. I think Republicans are sort of facing a moment where they had to rank the order of their principles. And I think at some level, holding a pro-life court, a more conservative court that will uphold small government became more important than the principle of this consistency that's sort of more abstract, especially to voters. And I think that this poses an issue for voters because it means that they then have to, in some way, figure out what the rank order of politicians' principles and values are in that situation. I think for people entering politics that is a really complicated thing to deal with, in recognizing that sort of all elements of power are associated with principle. And I think that there needs to be a big push to reframe and to refocus politics around upholding a more principle-based system.
So you're almost saying that their argument is equivalent to that famous quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, that foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. The point you're arguing is that for them, the principle of smaller government, of potentially limiting or ending the right to a national right to abortion is far greater principle than anything else. And for them, in this case, the ends of that principle justify the means of turning back on what they said in 2016, even though they stuck a flag in the ground and talked about principle, principle, principle back then. All right, who was next? Was it Andriana?
Yes, so I do believe this will have a major impact on how the upcoming Gen Z generation will participate in politics, both in voting and in the future when some of them start running for office. I know personally, as someone who I consider myself very politically involved and politically aware, but I'm a Democrat from a red state, and I've always disagreed with my senators and my leaders, but this event and the way that they are speaking about replacing RBG and going back on the word has really made me feel as if I do not have a voice in my own state, that if I were to talk to them in person and they found out that I was not voting for them, they would immediately brush me aside. They do not care what I have to say because I'm not voting for them. And I think in that, what I'm trying to say is that this event has really highlighted the partisanship of our politics and the desire to have, like you were saying, power in certain areas over kind of highlighting their integrity and their principle as leaders of the government and leaders of everyone in America, not just their constituent people who are voting for them. I agree with Bruce, though, in the sense that it doesn't matter if we talk about the hypocrisy, the lack of principle. It's not going to affect anything. The people who are voting for them are just glad that they have an open seat to fill and that they have a way to institute power in the Supreme Court for a long time. What I do think will be interesting about this election, now that we have the Supreme Court in play, will be how this affects power in Congress and in the presidential seat in the coming years. I think that Republicans are taking a gambit. They're saying that we value, I think as Maddie was saying, we value the Supreme Court and the principle of small government over kind of our outward principle and the principle of our word. And I think that will have effect on voters, maybe not as much this year, but I think also in the coming years with more Gen Z becoming eligible to vote, it creates a very strong lack of distrust around the GOP party. Not saying that the Democrats don't do this as well. Like Anya said, it's definitely a political thing on both sides, but this is just so public and so blatant, and Republicans can't even pretend that it's not hypocrisy. Honestly, all their arguments are pretty weak and floundering, that I think it will have a major impact on their power in Congress and their voice in all other areas of government except the SCOTUS for a long time.
So in some ways, it's obviously frustrating and disappointing and even to some extent alienating, but it may get your generation to double down on the determination to play this game as well, not to have illusions that this is a game of high-mindedness, that in many ways, perhaps sadly, it's a game of power. Who is next?
Exactly.
Chloe.
I completely agree. I think that something that we have to keep in mind is this isn't new. This lack of, what is the word we've been using? Principle isn't new. That's why we have career politicians, not just on the GOP side, but also on the Democrat side. That's why Schumer is still in power. That's why McConnell and Graham. There are life appointments even in Congress, and it's because of voter suppression laws, a lot of different reasons. But I don't think this lack of principle is something that is just happening and only in the GOP party. In the GOP. In terms of talking about what the effect is on younger generations, not even, I would say millennials and Gen Z, because I think millennials are now starting to run for office. I think there's a split in the approach to this lack of principle from our government. It's very either you're working within to try to change that. So we've seen actually a lot of breakthroughs in career politicians' careers, like Markey, even AOC. There's just a lot of newness coming in, which is good, and it's some sign of hope. But there's also this call to dismantle what we currently have, because the principles are so far out now of democracy, of true democracy, that I think younger generations, seeing what's happening right now with the Supreme Court, that might radicalize a lot more people into wanting to dismantle what is happening further.
So what you're saying is that this is saying that the system is broken and therefore it requires fundamental and deep change, and that may have an impact on your generation. That even though Bruce is right that hypocrisy may be a losing issue in the immediate, it's sinking into the sort of people of your generation who may get involved in politics and then may communicate a lot of these issues to your generation and help to guide your generation in a way that's going to say we need fundamental change in what we're doing. Who is next on this? Was it, I think it was Dan and then Manuel? and then Simona, and then we're going to move on to this other
Simona
part.
was going before me.
Oh, okay, all right.
So one thing I wanted to talk about was, okay, a possible silver lining if the GOP party does pick and gets a Supreme Court candidate. As I'm guessing already, specifically Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham have been really advocating, and in both of their states right now are really tight Senate races. And I know with Lindsey Graham specifically, he's already had like one scandal this year, and it wasn't a small one, it was a big one with like the DC male prostitutes he hired. Yeah, I didn't forget about that, Lindsey. So that plus this with his direct hypocrisy, like Adriana said, where she said that it was blatant, I think that Lindsey Graham's words from 2016 went over a line where he kind of acknowledges his own hypocrisy in that. Like, he went so far to be like, you can use my words against me, and described our exact situation, that I think that could be a really big thing and something that South Carolina voters are like, no. Then, if we look at Mitch McConnell's Senate race, I know that some former conservative Kentuckians who even see his ads don't even like them. They get upset because Mitch McConnell's ads right now in Kentucky have been like showing footage from like Seattle and Portland, and the people in Kentucky are like, that's not us. Like, that's not our state. You're not representing us. You don't speak for us. And I think Amy McGrath, the upcoming like candidate for Kentucky, has a really good shot. I've been monitoring her campaign for like almost a year now. She's been polling super well, and she polls well on both sides. And it just gives me, I think that also Kentucky voters who already don't like Mitch McConnell and think he's a sellout on both sides won't resonate with this. And I think that if there is a new Supreme Court justice, it'll be at a cost of possibly McConnell and Graham's seats. So there is that. And I thought that's just something important to highlight because they're very, very outspoken hypocrites in this situation and a few others.
So if I were the Democratic strategist, particularly in South Carolina, I'd be having different clips of Lindsey Graham and saying you can't trust his word, because we're seeing some movement in certain states in the South. Georgia, red state for many, many years, all of a sudden, as Manuel and Jeff were discussing yesterday, is tight, okay? Some people even see South Carolina down the line. If you are a Democratic strategist, you go specifically to those suburban voters and say, this is what he said, this is what he's now saying. Do you want this to be the lesson that you teach your kids in life? Which is you say one thing one day and then you change your mind the next based on what's only good for you, and that principle doesn't matter anymore. I would be pushing that out there and drilling it down. Now, it may not work because South Carolina is still redder than not, but you can put him on the defensive potentially if you do a barrage of ads along those lines. So, Simona, go for it, and then Manuel.
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick comment about the whole principle aspect of it. I would even argue that Republicans would argue that on a foundational level, staying true to their principle would be to fill the seat with someone who shares the same principles as the base. To them, the principle of not filling a Supreme Court seat during an election year, really is just the argument that they used in 2016 to again kind of stay true to the principle of the whole base. But that is really more an excuse, not a principle, and that's just plain politics. And I think I would probably even go as far to say that hypocrisy is the game of politics. It's sad, but it's true, So I just wanted to make that quick comment about that.
And it goes along with Maddie's point. In some ways it would have been refreshing in 2016 if they had just said, look, we have the power, you don't, we're not going to confirm your nominee, period. That's the way it works, that's politics, get over it, get real, let's move on to something else, okay? Because in effect, that's sort of what you're saying is what they've done anyway. But the bottom line is, again, people have different levels of principle, and what you're arguing is that in this particular case, level of principle of putting somebody on the Supreme Court who represents the more Republican view of government and social issues is far more important than whether somebody levels the charge of hypocrisy at them. Manuel.
Yeah, I completely agree with Simona. I think that the fact that we're talking about a Supreme Court vacancy loosens how hypocritical a politician can be in regards to filling a seat. But I think that, at least for our generation, this is the first time that we are seeing a magnitude of hypocrisy that is going to affect our lives well after Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham are not officered. And I think that is going to have an effect on young voter turnout. A couple of weeks ago, the past weeks, we've been asking ourselves, like, are young people going to vote? Are young people going to turn out? And I think the answer is going to be clear after this, And I think that what we haven't talked about is the importance of the vacancy being Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She wasn't just any Supreme Court justice. She was a Supreme Court justice that resonated with our generation. She was a pioneer in so many ways. She was beloved, and not just 2 hours after her death was announced, the Supreme Court was filled in a tribute that I don't think I've ever seen for a Supreme Court justice who passed away. So I think our generation is sort of coming to terms with, politics is hypocritical, but I think we're starting to reach a point where we're going to start to have to play the game if we're going to want to get people up there that represent us.
So politics may be hypocritical, but it has a big impact on your lives far beyond what's happening immediately, because this is long term. So Amrutha and Zach, just hold your comments. I'm going to get to you next because I just want to pop these things up along the lines of what Bruce was talking about, and then we'll continue this, okay? So Donald Trump goes out in Ohio, and you hear the chant at his rally. Fill that seat, fill that seat. And as Bruce said, these are the two leading candidates, Amy Coney Barrett and Barbara Lagoa, both of the Catholic faith, both arguably conservative. Lagoa more unknown, but of Cuban-American descent, which could have a big impact on the state of Florida. Coney Barrett, the argument is that she will excite social conservatives, and any attack on her faith, which happened during her confirmation hearing when Senator Feinstein questioned some aspects of how she applies her faith to her jurisprudence, could blow back and hurt Joe Biden and help Donald Trump in key Midwestern states among Catholic voters. And then you look at which side benefits. Well, in the immediate aftermath of Justice Ginsburg's death, the Democrats shattered their fundraising records in huge amounts, large sums of money. But on the other hand, you have people like Joni Ernst within hours of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, basically saying that this is all about, we can't place the power of the next nominee into the left's hands. We can't let that happen. It's up to us to ensure that a nominee is a principled constitutionalist, and please send money for that. And then you have David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report basically saying, hey, okay, who's going to benefit? Is this an issue of Catholic voters? Could that be? Or could this be an issue of Roe v. Wade? And look at his last thing here. Although Trump downplayed abortion in 2016, voters with mostly pro-choice attitudes made up more than a fifth of his support in plenty of battleground states, and you look at those numbers. And then above that, only 15% of Clinton's voters at least lean pro-life, and 11% held mixed views, 74% lean pro-choice, but 22% of Trump's voters at least lean pro-choice, and another 13 held mixed views. So the question is, who benefits? And one more thing, there's another benefit here, which is that if you get another member on the Supreme Court, the Republican Party may push through certain challenges to some of the mail-in voting that we're already seeing taking place in Pennsylvania, where the Republican legislature is now asking the Supreme Court to limit mail voting in Pennsylvania in the first post-RBG test. In this case, Pennsylvania allowed mail-in voting and allowed the votes to be counted for a few days after Election Day if those votes did arrive in the mail a couple days after Election Day and were postmarked beforehand. The legislature wants to challenge that. They believe the Supreme Court may be more friendly, and the president himself has said that this election could end up in the Supreme Court. So let's talk about, does this benefit anyone, and how does that work? So I know that Amrutha and Zach, you had some thoughts, and why don't you guys talk, and then we'll get to everyone else.
I think going off of what Manuel said and a little bit what Andriana said before, is the biggest thing we're going to see is the impact that this has not just on the court itself and all the court decisions, but the political repercussions outside of it. Because RBG was such a big figure that she was known as a notorious RBG. She was one of the most recognizable figures, I think, in liberal politics. And that's going to have further effects on not just court decisions, but all the swing races up for grabs in the Senate and the reputation of the parties moving forward. So I think it'll be really interesting to see, Trump has to walk a very thin line of filling this seat without doing any further damage to people whose races are up for grabs in the Senate. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the GOP handles that.
So the argument is that this will motivate the Republican base, but the flip side of that is it will further motivate the Democratic base because of the sense you're losing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, replacing her with an ideological opposite. And you have generations of young people walking around with T-shirts with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, face imprinted on them. Here's an 87-year-old woman who was an inspiration to 20-something. She had an outsized image and an outsized power. So arguably, this could further motivate the Democratic base, and it could further influence those suburban women voters that the president has been losing because of the prospect that this might not only mean a change in health care for your families, but a change in your daughter's sort of constitutional rights as they have been articulated since 1973 and the Roe v. Wade decision. Zach?
Yeah, I don't hate to generalize, but of course this is going to have an impact politically, and I think that Republicans know that, right? Mail-in voting, the way in which they've come so hard for mail-in voting, in the context that we're in with the coronavirus and everything, it feels intentional that they would not be trying to make that process easier rather than what they're doing now, which obviously benefits them because if less people vote, there's more likely a chance for Republicans to win this November. And I think that is just a fact that we've come to, and it's now just becoming a guiding principle, which is what we're discussing, I guess, in, I think, the Republican Party's more mainstream wing of their party. I think, of course, we're seeing a lot of the fringe influence sort of the political theater, but in reality, I think Republicans are still on the same page about what's going to help them take office and stay in office. And so I think that the now taking the issue to the Supreme Court is just going to help generate a lot of coverage and a lot of buzz and a lot of talk about it. But it's still ignoring the fact that we have a very serious moment right now where there's lots of things that this Supreme Court pick is basically relying on. I mean, gender discrimination, abortion rights, all kinds of things are on the line, and Republicans aren't necessarily trying to get to the more substantive implications of the Supreme Court pick. And I think that that's intentional. I mean, with people like, with Amy Coney Barrett, she's already been, a lot of liberals are already raising red flags about her because she belonged to a group that's been accused of abusing women who were in the group that she was in. And so it was a charismatic Christian group that people have brought up as concerns. But of course, there are lots of people on the right who are like attacking her religious beliefs is wrong in the first place. And that's going to be the argument that we see to continue out. But I just think that right now, to sort of like circle back around to this original conversation about principles and everything, I think that generally everyone's accepted what their party has to do to win. And that is the guiding principle in our politics right now. It's not, what is gonna be most digestible and most correct for the American public. It's really about what is going to ensure that we keep our jobs come November.
Yeah, and you know, I grew up in a generation inspired by John Kennedy, who was a politician, let's be clear, and understood power and understood what to do. But for my generation, you know, it was his inaugural. It was the Peace Corps. It was his stands on nuclear test ban treaties. It was his stands on civil rights that inspired so many people because we felt that he was speaking to our ideals. And to me, it's a little saddening to see a generation of very principled people feeling that politics is a place where you have to elbow people out and it's about bare knuckles and power rather than fulfilling those ideals. Now, maybe I'm being, you know, too sort of harsh here, but I do think this is a sad byproduct of the era that we're living in, and it's a rational response of your generation to think about it in those terms because of what we have seen this past week, where the word principle sort of means nothing when it's put into practice because power, for lack of a better word, does trump principle. Now, the politics of all of this is interesting. Manuel mentioned that Donald Trump was paying his respects to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Manuel, what was the chant that you were reporting?
Yeah, I just saw this. I got a notification. They started chanting "Vote him out." Like masses that are in front of the Supreme Court. He was standing there, and they just started to chant that.
So the question is, could this, you know, it's unclear how this is going to play out politically in the short term, but as Zach was saying, there could be some playing out in the long term. And let's go back to my slide here. Here are the issues. Look at this: abortion, the right to privacy, civil rights, affirmative action, voting rights, religion, LGBTQ rights, gun laws, the Affordable Care Act, campaign finance, immigration and birthright citizenship, whether the census enumeration covers only citizens, not persons, which is how the 14th Amendment describes it, gerrymandering, environmental laws, collective bargaining and worker protections, the Commerce Clause, and as we talked about yesterday in class, the ability to have a case even heard before the Supreme Court will change because you need 4 justices to be able to say whether a case is heard. And now the conservatives don't have to worry about a swing vote because they will have a 6-3 majority. These are serious issues. Think about religion and LGBTQ rights. Coming before the Supreme Court this year is a case called Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia, in which Catholic Social Services sued the city, claiming that the right to the free exercise of religion entitles it to a taxpayer-funded contract to perform government service, even though it is unwilling to comply with the city's requirement that contract agencies accept all qualified families, meaning gay and lesbian families, to be able to adopt children. Basically, what they're saying is that religious rights will triumph over the ability of gay and lesbian families to adopt children under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Social Services. Voting rights could change. Gun rights. Arguably, we may now have a majority on the Supreme Court that will strike down many local gun laws and potentially allow people almost everywhere in the country to walk around with open carry or concealed carry to be able to walk in those communities, despite what those communities may have wanted, because it will be argued that the Second Amendment triumphs over all of that. Environmental laws, as we discussed yesterday. The Commerce Clause potentially being limited may reduce the ability of the federal government to enact and put into place environmental laws that could deal with issues related to climate change. The census is an important one because the current census covers all persons, so therefore congressional districts and electoral college is based on all persons living in the United States, even people who are not here and who are here and not documented, whereas there's a movement to say it should only be citizens and not immigrants of any kind to be included in how our congressional districts and states are given a political representation. there is a lot at stake. And this stuff is long-term and short-term, the Affordable Care Act, and long-term, the issue of abortion. So, that being said, let's kick it to you and have you offer some thoughts on all of that. So anyone want to chime in on some of these particular issues and how they will impact you and your lives? So I see Jeff and Chanel and Amelia and Jenna and Zach. Go for it.
I mean, all of those issues are going to have an effect, but I think most importantly, we need to get the 60-vote threshold back for Supreme Court nominees, because otherwise, it's, as we've seen with Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, it's just become incredibly partisan in who is voting these justices in. And when was the last time the Senate had 60 votes in either party? I don't think it was this century, and it would allow for, you know, maybe a more moderate conservative justice, maybe a more moderate liberal justice, depending on who the president is, to come in there and maybe not take as much of a political stance on these issues and look at it with a little bit, you know, a little bit of a backseat to them, not like representing one party or another. And I just think that's very important and something that, you know, the Republicans kind of nuked the fridge on and, you know, did a disservice to our generation with that.
Would you support, if the Democrats gain control of the Senate, them moving it back to 60 votes if Joe Biden is president?
I mean, would I support it? I mean, I think, you know, I understand the question, and you're trying to trap me with this question, and I do understand what you are doing here. Look, the rules have changed, and there's nothing we can do about it. I would say, you know, if Joe Biden wanted to, why not maybe the next Republican president down the line and the Republican Senate down the line, if they're together, wouldn't move it back to 50 and a majority vote, 51 and a majority vote, or 50 if including the vice president. But I mean, that's up to him, and he has to play by the rules that are set for how the Senate set them.
Yeah, so the question is really, again, about principle and high-mindedness versus power. And that's what we come to in a political culture these days. So who was next? Was it Chanel? No.
Yeah, kind of to go off of Jeff's point, something I thought was interesting was really immediately after her death, there was a lot of mourning, but not just for her, but for all of these issues at stake. And I think it caused a conversation about how effective and like people-centered our democracy really is if the passing of one person, literally one person, could topple all of these key high-stakes cultural decisions in our country. And I think obviously like no one has the right answer because it's a structural issue and I don't think it can be changed overnight. But I think the fact that even in her last few hours, her biggest concern was who would replace her because she knew what that meant, I think begs the question of, you know, how is our democracy set up? And is it designed so that literally one individual holds that much power and weight in such high important issues in the country?
Yeah, and again, even though she was in the minority, a sense was that her voice might be heard, and there was a chance that some of her views could make it to the majority, depending on a swing vote. But now there's not a chance of that if you have such a large majority. And as some Supreme Court scholars have said, this will be the most conservative court in over 100 years. If the president's nominee is confirmed, which seems very, very likely. Who else was there? Was it Jenna? And then Amelia, okay?
Yeah, so I think we understand that a lot of issues are going to be severely impacted by the Supreme Court nomination. And I know it's like the topic of discussion, but I still don't think a lot of people, especially in our generation, just like kind of understand what exactly that impact will mean and what life will kind of be like if these issues change, especially on things like healthcare policies, the right of abortion, the right to get birth control, the right to deny healthcare if you don't want it, etc. Because like kind of in the same way where we've grown up in a post 9/11 world and we're used to certain things, we're used to these things too, and we're kind of used to them being there even if you disagree with them.
And so I think it will be interesting to see that as this nomination affects this wide range of policy issues, especially considering our climate change issues and like our current pandemic around healthcare and how that impacts people, just how people will kind of realize, especially in our generation, how that's going to change the way that they live. Because I think people understand that things are going to change, but I don't think they're really maybe connecting the dots on how that will affect them, even if they disagree with these policies that are in place.
And the large point is this stuff does have consequence, but people may not realize it right now because they've taken certain aspects and certain rights for granted that they've lived with. The last time we had huge Supreme Court controversy coming from the presidency was in the 1930s, when the Supreme Court was not allowing a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal laws to be enacted. Imagine if a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress push through climate change legislation. It goes to the Supreme Court and it's turned down as overreach. How do you deal with that major issue of your generation if it's not possible to do it legislatively? That's when sort of the rubber hits the road. And of course, as we will talk about in a moment, the issue of abortion rights. Amelia.
Yeah, I actually do think that people are really scared. I think issues like these, Roe v. Wade, environmental regulation, the Second Amendment, and the direction that these are going are really scaring Democrats. And as we know, like, fear can be a really powerful motivator in voting. So, and I think obviously Democrats are a lot more scared than Republicans. And given that Trump has already named 2 justices, I think that we're going to see maybe more positive benefits from Democrats. And at the same time, I think that Trump hasn't really been able to successfully portray Biden as like this super scary candidate to voters. So I think at the same time, Democrats are in a lot of fear right now, unlike Republicans. And hopefully that might show up.
And if you all read that article I wrote, it goes with the concept of loss aversion. People are far more scared of losing something than they are welcoming of gaining something. Obamacare was met with sort of middling support when it was passed, even though many people would have gained something. But the minute it was passed, it became more popular when the Republicans tried to undo Obamacare, because people feared losing its protections in that regard. So loss aversion is a big deal, and that's why I would argue that this may be exactly what you're saying, that it may motivate Democrats more than Republicans because of the fear of losing something. Now all right, so Robin, and then and Dan, and then I want to ask you about, and Christina, and then I want to ask you about the issue that is probably the most salient issue when people think about the Supreme Court, and that's Roe v. Wade. And I want to ask you if you think that will be overturned and what might happen because of that. So let's go with Robin, and who did I say was next? And
Dan and then Christina.
Yeah, Robin, Dan, and Christina. Thank you.
I think that the death of RBG has sparked something with young people, and I really, Jenna, I hate to disagree with you with your statement earlier, but I do. I mean, just 10 minutes after her death was announced, I saw hundreds of posts on social media. People were mourning the loss of the woman and all the things that we have what we're going to potentially lose if this new woman is elected, or not elected, but chosen to be a Supreme Court justice. And I think that young people are taking a look at this and saying, you know, I have had enough of this. People on TikTok and on Instagram and Twitter have talked about, you know, reframing the laws of the Supreme Court and how it's ridiculous that these people are appointed for life, and it's raising these discussions that I think are so important, because we are seeing that these politicians who are older, who are going to die soon, are making decisions for us, young people, that could affect us for the next 30 or 40 years. I think that it's raising good points among young people, and I really, really am hopeful that people our age are going to turn up and try to make a difference. I mean, celebrity influence on social media has helped to spark this and helped to promote the idea that your vote matters. And I really hope that young people, not just our age and people that go to a liberal school, but other people in a small town are looking at this and saying, you know what, it's time that me, the person, looks up these issues and sees that there's an issue and that we need to vote out the people that are going to cause us so much anguish in the United States. So I'm really hopeful that young people are going to see this and really try to make a change in the future.
So with a lifetime appointment, somebody whose worldview was forged maybe 4 decades ago could be having an impact on the law 4 decades from now. And that basically is what you're arguing, is that we shouldn't be governed by those whose experiences are from the past. We should be dealing with those who have to face the challenges of the present and the future, and that you think may motivate young people. Who is next?
Can I jump in here now?
Yeah, sure.
First off, I just got my camera, so I should get double my time back, okay? Because I just want to say this, because I've heard a lot of young people talk about the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I think somebody even suggested that her replacement on the Supreme Court should be of like mind. That doesn't happen, of course, when you change the politics, you got a different person in the White House, different political persuasion. I just want to remind people that when Thurgood Marshall's seat became vacant, Clarence Thomas replaced him, okay? So not only will there be change with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there will be gigantic, glacial changes as a result. And again, because elections have consequences and Democrats lost the election, you're going to have to live with the changes, and that's where the fight's going to be. The other thing, though, and this is really big to me when we talk to young people, I keep hearing this word, I hope. I hope they vote. I hope this happens. Hope this doesn't change. That's on you. At one point in time, we were the young people, and we were reminded by the freedom riders of the 60s. It's on you. Don't hope. Go make change. Be the change that you seek. So I just say that to young people, go vote and take somebody with you. I'm going to tell you who to vote for. That's on you. But you got to vote. You can't hope. You got to go vote. That's all I wanted to say right here. I just think that needs to be said.
All right. And who is up next?
I'm done.
Yeah, all right. Who was up next? Was it Dan, and then who was next?
Christina.
And then Christina. All right, go for it.
So, you mentioned LGBTQ rights, and I'll always talk about this because I think they're so important. And in kind of, not comparison to abortion laws, but they're kind of overlooked. And I think it's important for discussing like a Supreme Court justice and the damage they could do. It's also important to acknowledge the damage that this administration has done and the attitudes held by the administration. For example, in 2017, Trump joked about Vice President Pence's anti-gay agenda, saying, quote, "Don't ask that guy, he wants to hang them all." So that on top of the fact that with the trans military ban, the sending trans people when they go to prison to the wrong prison, along with creating religious divisions to allow doctors to refuse LGBTQ people medical attention, and many, many other awful discriminatory policies. The only policies that could be really taken away is the gay panic defense, the right to marriage, which is not life or death, respectively, the newly put anti-discrimination laws for workplaces, and then one that comes to mind is how evangelical Christians have been trying to get the LGBTQ community removed from the anti-lynching bill that Mike Pence wants to hang us all. So I think that it's really overlooked, and I feel like that it's not just life or death for other communities, that LGBTQ community will specifically like it can only get worse, and it's not really reflected, and it's not talked about or not as passionate, because with abortion rights, it applies to around 50% of the population. It's a widespread issue, no matter your race, or religious belief or whatever. That applies to every single person who can have an abortion or want an abortion. So I think it's just super important to highlight that, with the LGBT community, marriage is low stakes, but there's other policies that are actually life and death that are really important to highlight and say if Trump does get one of his first pick, I think it's Amy Coney Barrett. I forget how to pronounce her name, but if she gets picked, it could be much more than just not marriage equality. It would literally be with life or death, and it's really, really scary.
So, but do keep in mind that it was a conservative justice, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion on the discrimination against LGBTQ folks. And so it's not written into stone that because somebody is more conservative that they're generally going to sort of go against particular sort of more liberalized social issues. But what your concern is far greater in the sense that can certain prejudices be written into the law constitutionally by a ruling of the Supreme Court, and what consequence can that have in the communities around the country who feel they then have the license to pursue certain policies and actions that may be deleterious and actually harmful to people. And I think it's that permission structure that the court can help create that may cause all sorts of problems in reality and practice if they are so ruled by the Supreme Court. Christina.
Yes, just to reiterate your point, Professor, I was going to say that we have to remember that conservative judges aren't like conservative politicians. There's a difference between being a conservative in law and being a conservative in like social issues. And just to reiterate your point, it was Justice Neil Gorsuch, which was President Trump's first appointee to the court, that wrote the majority opinion when the 1964 Civil Rights Act protected the LGBTQ employees from discrimination. And I think it's also important to point out that it was Kavanaugh that said some of the court's most notable and consequential decisions have entailed overruling precedent, which I think may illuminate to maybe Roe v. Wade being protected, and maybe some of these judges who are deemed more conservative being more of a swing vote than we may think.
And in fact, when you look at flag burning, for example, Justice Scalia said that was protected under the First Amendment, and Justice Scalia was very conservative. And their argument is that you look at the Constitution as it was written and intended back then and apply those rules. And in this case, Gorsuch looked at that particular law, or Scalia did, and applied it that way. But that then brings us to the other issue, which is that across the board in conservative jurisprudence, regardless of conservative politics, Roe v. Wade is considered a wrongfully decided law. How many of you think that Roe v. Wade may be overturned in the next 10 years of your life? Almost everybody. In fact, I think everybody. Does anyone want to comment on what that means? Anyone? Amrutha, and then Andriana, and then Zach.
I would say that that means so much in terms of health and safety, not just for women, but for, as Dan mentioned, people of the LGBTQ community as well, because Roe v. Wade guarantees access to abortion and the national right to abortion. So I think what we see, and the point that a lot of Democratic lawmakers are going to continue to make, is that getting rid of access to abortions doesn't stop them from happening, and only stops safe and healthy abortions from happening. So I think we'll continue to see the negative effects that that has on the health and safety of all people who try to get abortions, because right now there are already really heavy restrictions on people in a lot of red states across the country who would like to get access to safe and healthy abortions, but that is going to become heavily restricted if Roe v. Wade is overturned, and there will be so many negative consequences. And like I said, it will only stop people from having access to healthy and safe medical procedures.
And as you would probably argue one step further, people of means in any state will be able to get it. People without means in states where it's restricted would be the most potentially harmed by this. think, Adriana, were you next?
Yes, I agree that it's going to greatly affect women's safety. You know, as Amrita said, it's not going to stop abortions. It's definitely not going to stop abortions for the rich and the powerful. But I think, you know, it goes broader than that. I think reversing Roe v. Wade and saying that the right to privacy in that sense is overturned, I think we could definitely see an effect on access to other reproductive rights and other reproductive health care, like access to birth control, employer birth control under funding for Planned Parenthood, funding for access to prenatal care and stuff like that. Just a lot of different ways that women's reproductive rights and health care are shamefully neglected. We already see such discrimination in the sense that, like, you know, a lot of healthcare insurances cover Viagra for all of the men and not all of them cover birth control, you know. We already see this discrimination. We can already see it going like broader. We can see it going broader if Roe v. Wade is overturned in many instances. So I think it's a huge concern that I think a lot of people aren't looking at in terms of the broader effect and the long-term effect of overturning Roe v. Wade and the effect that it could have on women's health care for a long period of time and not just access to abortion. But I think also when you look at the two justices that Trump is mulling over, Barrett and Lagoa, Lagoa has no record on abortion or Roe v. Wade and like has no stated stance on it, while Barrett does. So I don't know if it's as certain with these justices as we might fear, but I do think there's a high chance. So.
And it's also the right to privacy, which is encoded into the Roe v. Wade decision. If that is not seen as a fundamental right, because many conservatives have argued that there's no right to privacy in the Constitution, that would not just affect abortion issue, it could potentially affect many other issues as well. Again, we don't know this, and as Christina said, things may surprise you. We just don't know how it all plays out. But at least on the record, we do know that there have been deep concerns among conservative jurisprudence about the right to privacy and the Roe decision, and that is somewhat well documented, even though we can't be 100% certain as to how that might play out in a Supreme Court decision. So a couple more, and then I want to move on to one other question related to this. I think it was Zach and Manuel.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo what everyone else was saying about the fact that central to the abortion debate has never been about whether or not abortion should be about like what is legal and what is not legal, but it's about more controlling who has access to an abortion and who doesn't. And so I think that what we're seeing is like conservative justices constitutionally, they side with people who for them it's not much of a concern. So I think that what we're seeing is like a huge imbalance of power that's constantly being mirrored out in our politics, but also like here in this direct situation. I mean, it's hard to tell what the future of Roe v. Wade will be, but RBG, I think that part of her legacy is knowing how critical she was of the very decision about Roe v. Wade. I think that if any person who considers themselves kind of like either a legal scholar or a constitutional scholar doesn't seriously consider whether or not the ways we've conscripted abortion rights in this country can be changed, I think that now is the time where they really sort of tackle the question of how to make sure that that is something that is secure moving forward. And I think, and my last point is that the way that this impacts people with outsized influence, like Planned Parenthood, like the Susan B. Anthony list, which I'm still just like so taken aback by the interview that the president just did on The Daily with Michael Barbaro. This is a huge opening or a huge moment for anti-abortion activists to really come center stage and make what will be seen as valid points, right? And so I think that right there, we are going to see a fast-paced movement for the anti-abortionists that will actually probably gain some traction.
So two interesting points in what you were saying that are relevant. It's not just a matter of abortion, but it's who has access to certain aspects of society, that whether Roe exists or not, people of means will have access, people without means don't. And that's a metaphor for so much of what else is going on in our society. Access to the benefits of America is often sort of enhanced if you have means. But the second thing is, as you mentioned, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was always concerned that there wasn't the popular will to encode abortion into the law rather than to have it through Roe v. Wade. And the question then might be that whether overturning Roe v. Wade will actually create a sea change, particularly among your generation, to change the law of the country and make a Supreme Court ruling ultimately irrelevant if those laws are actually changed. So that was her whole point early, is that you got to allow the country to be ready for something before the court rules on something so personally. And maybe it would have been better had Roe not happened and the political process taken place, because she was confident that at that moment in time, the law might have changed nationally in favor of abortion rights. At least that was part of her argument. So Manuel.
I think Madeline had her hand up before me.
All right.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that coming from a place like Texas, abortion, every legislative session, there are a number of bills that go across state legislators' desks with attempts to ban abortion. What is really protecting abortion in this state and in many other states, many conservative states in the country, is this Supreme Court decision. I think if that is overturned, that there by a conservative court, that is going to really, really prevent access to safe and legal abortions. I think going out of state just is not a possibility for too many people. And I think that this presents an issue in Texas. Between big cities, there's 4 hours. It's just impossible for people, even those maybe with means to have a car, to really make that drive to have access to a safe and legal abortion. And I think that what we will see in sort of the youth will have to be a sort of like upturn in pushing for progress on this issue at the congressional level, if that is what is to occur. But I also do not know how effective that will be in states where it is a majority conservative opinion and legislatures tend to lean that way already.
And let's just take that one step further, because there are certain states, such as Louisiana, that have pretty much said if Roe is overturned, abortion will be made illegal in those states. The legislators try to say that women obtaining an abortion would not be arrested. But again, that's not altogether clear. But doctors and nurses helping women obtain abortions illegally could be put in jail and could be arrested. And so it's not just a theoretical thing. It's actually potentially imprisoning people for violating the law in those states. So this could ripple in just some very, very fundamental ways. So 2 more comments on this, and then we're going to move to something related. Manuel and Amrutha.
Yeah, I do think that Roe v. Wade is at risk, and far from the implications that it will have if it's reversed on women's reproductive health, I also think of the optics of it a lot. Over the past few days, I've just been coming back to Kamala Harris's quote when she was, in Kavanaugh's confirmation, where she asked him, can you think of any law that giving the government the power to regulate a man's body? And I just keep coming to that because I think that basically encaptures this whole argument that if they were to reverse Roe versus Wade, it would just be so bad on so many levels that go just beyond women's reproductive health. And I also kind of wanted to ask you, I know that Kamala is in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I think, and I don't know how that would fit into her campaign schedule if she has to go to a confirmation hearing. But I also think that it could kind of be good for her if she had to, because it would bring all of our feelings as young liberal Americans into the political, I don't even know how to say it, but yeah.
So it would give her a platform as a senator on that committee asking those questions. And in fact, if the Democratic Party were smart, a lot of those senators would yield their time to her to enable her to prosecute that case. Not all the time, because it can't be all her, but if I were organizing this, I would yield as much time as possible to her to be able to ask some of those questions, because you want to give her that platform to appeal to the types of voters that you want her to reach. And this is certainly one way to do it beyond reaching people on Zoom in very selected campaign events. This is nationwide TV confirmation hearings. Was it Amrutha?
I also wanted to make the point that even with Roe v. Wade being in the state that it is, there have already been a number of laws that restrict abortions, especially in a lot of states. I can't remember which exactly state it was, but there have been so many laws put into place, like abortion clinics have to have hallways that are a certain size and have to be a certain distance from a school. So there have already been so many different ways to restrict access to abortion that it's already under attack in this country, and I think Roe v. Wade would kind of be the final nail in the coffin. And then the last thing that I wanted to add is actually a different case, the Hobby Lobby case, which made it legal for employers to not pay for birth control under insurance. And so I think, that case went the way of Hobby Lobby, but I think you're going to see more decisions like that go further in regulating, what corporations are and aren't able to do in terms of restricting women's reproductive health.
And the Hobby Lobby case was really decided on the issue of religious freedom, that if you're an employer and you do not accept birth control as a viable thing, you should not be forced to pay for it under law. Therefore, your religious freedom in the First Amendment triumphs over any other possible law in that particular case. And part of the jurisprudence of a lot of the folks who are now in the majority on the Supreme Court generally favor that form of religious freedom to be able, again, for lack of a better word, trump other types of rights on all of this. And you're right, there are laws passed all over the place. There was a Texas law that was struck down a couple of years ago, and then a Louisiana law that was struck down this time around with John Roberts in the majority, who has been actually sort of in favor of overturning Roe in the past. But the reason why he sided with the majority is because of the Texas law set a precedent, and the Louisiana law was almost exactly the same as the Texas law. But in his ruling, he did basically say the only reason he's doing this is not because he supports this law, but because he supports precedent. So expect some of these laws that you're talking about to come before the court and to see how they are adjudicated. So I want to sort of broaden this out to another part of this conversation, which is this. And just quickly note on this. In the current Senate, the Republican majority, according to Vox, represents about 15 million fewer people than the Democratic minority. And then Norm Ornstein in a tweet. I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% will choose 70 senators, and the 30% will be older, whiter, and more rural, more male than the 70%, unsettling to say the least. And at the bottom, although Democrats have won more votes in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections, there will soon be a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Since 1969, Democrats will have appointed only 4 Supreme Court justices out of the 19 who have been confirmed, including the presumed appointment this year. So, thinking about that, does this pose a larger question about the future of our democracy when the vast demographic majority may feel that it is disenfranchised, not only in terms of voting, but in the Senate and on the Supreme Court? What does this say to your generation? This is a potentially big issue that when I'm asked, when I give speeches, I say this is what troubles me the most, is that the majority may feel completely disenfranchised because they don't have a voice based on the way our system is structured, yet it's still arguably the best system in the world to represent as a representative democracy. What's this dilemma here? So we're going to go, so you guys got to remind me, I'm going to go Chloe, Ryan, Riddy, Andrea, and Zach.
So I'm from New York City, and every election that, so I've only been able to vote in this election, but last election was obviously the primary. But even before we were all allowed to vote, my friends and I would talk about the fact that it doesn't matter. We were going to be blue anyways. They don't even come to us. They don't care what we have to say. And New York City is pretty big. We have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, and that's only going to get bigger. We are probably one of those cities that more like the majority are going to move to, and the fact that even currently, this isn't just a future issue, it's a present issue of the fact that this specific place that houses so many immigrants and children of immigrants and people who are just, you know, suffering on a daily basis, their issues don't matter to politicians. Our issues don't matter to politicians, and it's really frustrating. It makes me not care. I know high school teachers of mine who didn't vote in 2016 because they were like, it doesn't matter. We're going to be blue anyways. What's the point? So when I hear people say, why don't you vote, to like a lot of people, I do vote, but I understand why people don't vote. I understand why people don't believe in this democracy, because from where I am, we don't get to participate in the democracy the same way that people in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio get to. That's just how it is, I guess.
So that's a deeply troubling statement about, you know, something that should be a, you know, sort of sacred trust, democracy to all of us. Who was next? Ryan.
Yeah, I agree with Chloe. I think, especially as like a reporter, this is definitely something I want to cover in the future. I think it also couples with the larger issue, I guess, of like changing demographics, and that sort of this idea that I think a strategy among like GOP officials is to try and use sort of either the structure of government and also these kind of interesting or, you know, quirks of the system like the Electoral College to keep power essentially, despite attracting, you know, a minority of voters. And I think looking at also like, you know, the demographic differences and changes occurring in the country, it will be, you know, very contentious if, say, the GOP and the Congress overall, you know, remains overwhelmingly white in a country that increasingly won't be so white. And I think if Democratic voters and, you know, the coalition Democrats attract feel increasingly disenfranchised, I think, you know, in the decades to come, you could see, you know, potential, you know, even like violence over that.
Yeah, it's very concerning if we say we have a democracy and yet your voice isn't heard because of the structure of our republic. That creates incredible dissonance and potential for conflict. Who is next up? Riti, go ahead.
I agree with what Chloe and Ryan have to say. I mean, based on my personal experience right now, this is the first time I'm eligible to vote, and I'm in India, so I'm going to be sending my mail-in ballot from here. And I don't know if it'll get in or if it'll even reach. But when I talk to people, they're like, well, where are you from? And I'm voting from New Jersey. And so they're like, oh, okay, it doesn't really matter. And that's sort of how I'm comforting myself too, for me, is that it doesn't really matter. But I think that's also really scary that, you know, we talk about how every vote matters and then truly it doesn't. If you're from a certain, like if you're red leaning or blue leaning, it doesn't matter that much. And then on top of that, I think that reality, the more people have to face it, the more they vote and the more they see no change in the direction that they want there to be change, I think is very discouraging. And I think that'll affect voters now, like going far into the future.
And so listen to your comment here. You are among the most engaged group of young people around, and yet there's that side of you that says it doesn't matter. To me, that's very, very, very concerning. Not because of what you said, but in the larger context of what it represents. Who is up next? Andrea.
I think that a key word that you said when asking us the question was that America is arguably one of the best functioning democracies. I think that I would actually really push back against that, and I would argue that it is not at all. We see that there are democracies that are significantly more efficient than ours, that are more representative than ours. I think the Electoral College and the fact that we use the first past the post really just hurts us. And you know, I don't need to tell everyone that people on the coast have less proportional representation than the people in the Midwest solely because of population. And I think that that is a deep flaw in our system. It's just how we do elections. The fact that it is first past the post doesn't matter if you are actually liked by a good amount of people, like the majority of the people. It's just as long as you win, as long as you have more votes, that's enough. And that's really not representational of the people, of what they want. Someone in the chat had talked about how they are replacing, or Amy Coney Barrett, who's the most likely to be nominated, is a woman, and how that probably had a pretty big role to play in replacing RBG, and how you can't just replace a woman with a woman and say that it's the same thing, because we're just so caught up in this, like, these symbolic things and this representation that doesn't really matter, because it's not what's going for our ideals. And I think that, yeah, it really, you asked if it hurts our democracy, and I think that it absolutely hurts and punishes us, because we're not being voiced, our voices aren't being heard, and we're not being taken seriously. And we need major reform in how our representatives are being elected. And I think that something more similar to a mixed member proportionality system would be significantly more representative, and people would be able to feel like they had a voice, and it would take us away from this solely having this two-party system.
And to give a vivid example of what you're saying, Wyoming has one senator for every 300,000 people who live there. California has one senator for every 20 million people who live there, which means that the voice of somebody from Wyoming, based on our system, is 70 times more powerful than the voice of somebody who lives in California. But that's still the system we've had over time. And the question is, are you ready to even blow up the Senate? And if so, that creates something far larger than what we're even talking about right now. So you want to follow that up?
Yeah, I just want to say that this idea of like radical or like revolution, like all things that have occurred have started with a revolution. America itself, our inception was a revolution, and I think that it is something that could be done. And yes, I think it would create a lot of chaos, but out of chaos comes order, and I think that we could find something better out of it, because revolutions shouldn't necessarily be viewed as a negative thing, but they can incite progress.
The flip side of that, of course, is the old phrase, be careful what you wish for, you may get it, right? So who is up next? I think, was it Zach? And then Andriana.
Okay, so just indulge me very quickly with it. This is sort of like a kind of one of those like meta thoughts, but I think it's something that for me has always been a big thing when looking at studying politics. We have a huge pedagogical issue in the way that we talk about democracy in the United States, and that is that we talk about it as if it is a system that inherently exists because we've written it down and we've taught history that makes us think that that is what we are living under. And if you look at different ideals, you'll understand really like our system is more reflective of something similar to like a necocracy, right? Where a lot of dead people who are now dead wrote the rules of the game, and we still follow those rules. And therefore, there's been little room for change or growth. And a large part of our politics has been a cultural battle about whether or not we're going to keep those rules or whether or not we're going to reform them. And I think largely the way we are taught those things is just like, oh, you know, we live in a democratic society, it's a two-party system, this is just how it works. But I mean, I think that ignores the single intention of the framers that we also never talk about, which is the Constitution can be changed. it can be changed. That was literally something written into it, but it's something that's never been brought up. It's never been a part of the central goal of reform. And so I think that it's crazy to think of the irony that in 2040, old white men will have more control over our representation as the country in that exact same year becomes a majority country. Like, I think that to me right there says like, okay, so obviously our generation is presented with the single, I guess, the original sin of America, that what is holding us back has been systemic racism that has been built into our system of democracy that has taken so much impact that we have not actually addressed it. So therefore, of course, we're going to almost 3 centuries later still be dealing with the impact of that. And so I think that, like, just thinking about that to me just blows my mind, because I'm like, it's crazy to think that, you know, everyone wants to be like, oh yeah, you know, we're just so sick of this politically correct thing, and, you know, older white men are walking around feeling so fragile and sad because they're like, oh, everyone is just so upset because we're just, no, you literally have been written to have more power than everyone else, and that is constantly reflected. So that's just how I'm feeling. I'm sorry, like, that is just crazy. It's really crazy.
Now, the flip side to that, Zach, of course, is that the principles that were written into our Constitution have inspired democracies everywhere around the world. And even if our structure isn't always consistent with those principles, it becomes the task and duty of each generation to replenish those principles and to make that system work better. So the question is, in using that old phrase, how do you avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater? And I think that becomes the real challenge for your generation in trying to figure out how to make everything you say put in practice, but doing it in a way that doesn't potentially risk that chaos that Andrea was referring to as a possibility in all of this. And I think that's the real challenge.
But Lenny, let me piggyback on that. I just think this is excellent. I listen to Zach, and I mean, you're very good, and I go back and I listen to what Jeff had to say about the 60 votes in the Senate. But you could take what you guys are saying and go either direction, right or left with this. You could use what you said to say, well, it doesn't matter, won't do anything. Or you roll up your sleeves and you say, we got a lot of work to do. Let's get started, starting November 3rd. I just think this is fascinating. This is good stuff. And what I would say to you is, you got a lot of work to do. It's up to you to fix it and make it better. It's the system that we have. You're absolutely right when you talk about what a flawed system it is. Call it the best if you want, best at the time, Lenny, or whatever. It is a flawed system. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, you know, to these white suburban women who are so important in this coming election, the founding fathers did not have you in mind. They didn't give you a vote. Black men got the right to vote before you did. We're talking about Roe versus Wade, a lot of issues that are so important to you. You can't afford to sit out this election. My thing is, this is a referendum on Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not going to make a speech here, but even as a journalist, we've got serious issues here. We are making the mistakes. We're covering this election just like we covered 2016. Big mistakes. It was all about Donald Trump. I haven't heard enough from Trump supporters, the people on the front lines. What are their issues? We are just covering the president, the administration, and then we're doing polls. We're not covering real people and their issues and their pain and suffering. It's a big problem. I think the media is gonna have to pay for this at some point in time, because just like we're talking about changing the system, the country and that sort of thing, we have to change a lot in the media too. And so you guys, when you come out here, have your sleeves rolled up and be prepared to make these changes.
So piggybacking on something Bruce said, and Bruce said before, young people decided to challenge the structure of Jim Crow by boarding buses and going and risking their lives, as we saw with John Lewis and so many others. Young people went down to Mississippi, black and white young people, to challenge the restrictions on voting in 1964 with the Freedom Summer. Young people challenged Jim Crow in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 with fire hoses and German shepherds coming their way. Young people who thought the Vietnam War was wrong mobilized and organized and did something about it. So I guess the question Bruce is posing to you all is if everyone is going, Zach in 2020, for what Zach just said, is what do you do about it as a generation? Is it the sense that, oh my gosh, this system is rigged and I can't do anything about it and it's understandable why people sit it out? Or do you double down and actually try and do something about it beyond just posting on social media? And so I think that's really a generational question, which becomes very fascinating when I hear the frustration that so many of you are talking about in this regard. So I know there are a few hands raised up here. So I see Adriana and Robin and Maddie and Manuel and Chloe and Dan. And then I want to move on to something else that's associated with this based on the president's, what the president said yesterday. Go for it.
So it's kind of hard to follow Zach and Bruce's great points and great topics, but I will do my best. So I think we are going to see a divergence from the path we are currently taking. Like Zach was saying, we're currently on the path for 2040 to have more of the minority representing the majority of the country as this country continues to diversify. But I think we're going to start seeing a change in path from that already. And as you're saying, I think we're going to see more young people decide that it's time to take action and make change than be apathetic and sit out, because we understand that being apathetic and sitting out, kind of just losing faith in the system, isn't going to change the system. It's not going to change anything. It's only going to take power away from us. I was reading over some of the articles that Dan and Stephanie have for their Gen Z topic, and it was saying how in 2018, 2/3 of voters 18 to 29 voted Democrat, which is the largest party gap in 25 years. And I think that's a big indicator of the direction this country is going. I think a lot of that portion isn't voting Democrat in the traditional sense that they have faith in the Democratic Party and its politicians. I think it's more voting Democrat as an indication of the left-leaning swing that we are going to see in the young population as we get older, the general population. I think that's a big indicator of our referendum on the political system itself, that we're saying, we don't want it to stay like this. We need massive change, massive reform, systemic change on every level. It is interesting to hear a lot of older people, I believe, say this is the Constitution, you have to stick by the Constitution. Constitution can change. It's already changed 26 times. We have 26 amendments, and the first draft is never the best. We are taught that in high school, So I think that there is not only actual room in the Constitution to change that was built in by our founding fathers. I think that we will see it for sure in this generation's ideology. I think we're going to see a lot of shift away from faith in the electoral party system. I think we're going to, or not the electoral party, the electoral college system. I think we're going to see a lot of change in deciding the equality of senator votes and within, if you're saying Wyoming versus California. I don't know if it's going to happen soon, but in our lifetime, I'm definitely certain that we're going to see this system flip in big ways. So, and as Bruce was saying, you could go either right or left with the ways you were talking about, but I definitely see the trend left and more progressive, just based on the stats we see how young people are voting and viewing American politics.
And if you're right, and the voters in your generation go in that direction, yet run up against that Senate number that I talked about, in which 15 states will have 70% of the population. 35 states will have 30% of the population, older, whiter, less diverse, and they will have 70 senators. Those two forces are going to come up, push against each other, and that's where I do think some of this friction in our democracy is going to be taking place. Who is next? Robin.
Yeah, going off your point earlier, I'm really sick of older people, aka the people that lived through eras where young people prompted change and took action to make change that they wanted to see happen. Not value people our age because we're so technologically advanced or that we're on social media. Social media helps to connect all of us together. I mean, I'm able to talk with somebody from Ireland about their abortion policies, or somebody from Kentucky about what they think about the Roe v. Wade situation. It allows me to connect to people, grow my worldview, and help me to see other people's points of view. That way, when it comes time for me to vote, I can have all the different perspectives that I want without just relying solely on the news. And like we've talked about, and how our coverage of the news, Simone and I's coverage, how it frames it in a way that it's mostly about, the president, but what really matters are the issues and people talking about the issues. So social media allows us an opportunity to talk about those issues with people. If you wanted to have a conversation with a Trump supporter about why they support Trump, you can have a conversation with a Trump supporter. And you can have these important conversations and grow your worldview. But because it's a technological advancement and because it's social media, these old people are so quick to downplay it and to make us feel like our voice doesn't matter just because we're using modern advancements. I'm so sick of that, and I hope that changes. I mean, it's going to change because they're going to die out, and we're going to still be here, but it's just so annoying.
Don't rush Bruce and me too quickly, but the question becomes, does the immersion in social media, as empowering as it may be in terms of those conversations and the ability to acquire knowledge, how does that lead to the political change you're talking about beyond creating the opportunity to gain that information? So what is that next step beyond social media that I think is what Bruce and I are asking? And you can follow that up if you wish.
I'm kind of curious to see what Zach has to say, because he was like nodding his head and all that stuff. So I yield my time to Zach.
Well, Manuel had his hand up first, so I can go there.
Oh, it's real quick. I just thought it's very interesting how you bring up where to go beyond social media, just because yesterday I was reading an article for a class that talked about collectivism and how activists organizing via social media only leads to movements that are much more prone to die out rather than typical grassroots campaigning, where you are forced to have sort of these infrastructures in different places that withstand the test of time. So I think we're at a point where the social media part of things is done. Like, we are on it. We are on top of the news. Like, we are sharing, we are spreading the news, we are talking about what's important to us, and now we just have to translate that into actual momentum that takes it to the streets, to our governments, create infrastructures in places where we need them, have nets all over the country where we can build sort of, I would say, a leadership, I think is the word I'm looking for, that will take our priorities and our agenda as young people to Washington and to Congress and build the change that we want to see.
One of the reasons why evangelical churches have such high rates of voting and impact is because people see each other at church regularly, and they get together and they organize in their communities. And they say, "Grandma, do you need a ride to the polls?" And Grandma says, "Yes, and please take me." And they organize those things in a very personal and interpersonal way. So again, the question becomes, how does one translate the empowerment Robin is talking about on social media into real life political work? And I do think it, as Manuel was suggesting, that there's an intensity in social media, but it doesn't have a long life. There's an intensity in the evangelical church, but it has a long life. So the difference is how you translate that virtual connection into something that's real and tangible. And I do think that's going to be one of the political challenges of your generation, to be able to figure out how to channel that energy into something that actually translates into the types of changes and political force that, let's say, the evangelical churches have been able to acquire since the 1970s in American politics.
Lenny, can I put the question this way? This is coming from a reporter, because this is what we're hearing. I think Lenny and I are saying the same thing. People that share your concerns and your political persuasion, when I talk to them, what they say about young people, they look at your numbers, they look at your agenda, and they embrace it, they love it. But then they always end up by telling me, Bruce, we don't know that we can trust young people to show up. We don't know that we can trust them to go from protests to politics, from the streets to mail-in ballots and showing up at the polls. So my question to you, for them, can they trust you to do more than just talk the talk? Can they trust you to walk the walk come November 3rd?
All right, so I see two hands up, Jenna and Chloe.
I would say yes, not just considering the circumstances, but we've also kind of seen it, especially amongst Trump supporters, is that they are using social media as a way to actively campaign and meet and discuss, but then they're also taking that social media and going out into the rallies and going out into polls and such. I know that in Pennsylvania especially, there's a large grassroots campaign going on for Trump's campaign. And I think that even though it is on the Republican Party platform, like, it is taking shape. A lot of people are using social media as a tool, a communication tool, but they have that unity, and because they have that sort of similar ideal base to older generations, they are going out to rallies and they are planning mass group carpools to polls in Pennsylvania, I know, amongst my conservative friends with older people. So it's kind of how, like Professor Steinhorn, you were saying, how evangelicals meet daily in church and they talk. I think that we've seen amongst in the Trump campaign and amongst Trump supporters that they are using social media, yes, but they are going out and they are really planning to go to these polls. And we do see it on the other side too, with Biden and the more liberal campaign. I just think that the most prevalent example of people, younger people, actually going out and acting on what they're saying is amongst the Trump rallies and in the Trump campaigns, because we have people traveling from all over the country to go to his rallies. I had to do a media analysis on his most recent rallies that he did, and there was a large percentage of younger voters who came from like all corners of the country to come to North Carolina and Michigan. So I feel like if we see these people driving all the way to these rallies to see President Trump speak, then yes, they're going to take the time to go to the polls or do mail-in voting or something. So just as like an example there.
And it also speaks to the moment that we're in, and what we talked about a little in class yesterday. People have Zoom fatigue, you have screen fatigue, and everyone wants to be back on campus interacting with each other. There's something very important about that. That's not to diminish at all social media, but it's a media, it's a medium. It's when Bruce and I were growing up, we had mimeograph machines and phone trees to be able to get to people. We used those media at that time, but the result was getting people there to effect change. So I think that's the question about the bridge your generation builds on, how to go from this incredibly empowering medium you have to creating the change. And what Jenna is saying is that it is happening, but she's more certain, at least, that it's happening among those who are very enthusiastic on behalf of the president, rather than those who may be enthusiastic on the other side. So, Chloe, I think you had your hand up on this, and then let's see who else. I think Dan and Amrutha, and then Zach, and then I'm just going to ask another question right after that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think it's dangerous to generalize. I think it's dangerous to generalize for all generations. So, like, I don't like to use the term, I don't like to be like, all old people hate social media. But I think the reason that I say it's dangerous to generalize in terms of whether or not people are walking the walk is sometimes I think we use voting and voting numbers as a factor for how politically active a certain demographic is. And to a lot of people in this generation who are using social media to mobilize, November 3rd is not a deadline on their activism calendar. A lot of these people don't care about the system, don't think that it works for them. And so instead of voting, what they're using social media to do in terms of enacting change is mobilizing for mutual aid funds for their communities, using it to, we saw this a lot during the protests, that a lot of people were using it as jail support after people leave, after getting, arrested for protesting. So I think it's dangerous when we talk about November 3rd being the day that we find out if Generation Z is active politically and if we're doing the work, because the work does not end after an election season. Every single day, there are people from our generation, from millennials, from all generations, working outside of this voting system that we've already criticized during the session, because for a lot of people, it has never worked. And it wasn't meant to work for them. I know that in our application, it was like, is the system broken? What I argued, and I'll be completely honest with this, is that the system is not broken. It's working perfectly fine for the people that it's supposed to work perfectly fine for. And so the people who it doesn't work perfectly fine for work outside of November 3rd as a deadline, work every day to make sure that their communities are taken care of. And that's a political action, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. That was great.
Yeah, and I think you're 100% right, though I would add that it's not mutually exclusive. Both can happen simultaneously. And especially when you look at the consequences of some of the political decisions that emanate from voting, people are upset about that, the same people who are doing the community activism you're talking about. So they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they should be win-win rather than, one or the other. And so I do think everything you're saying is important and eloquently stated, but it doesn't mean that the same people who are doing that should just give up on the other side, because it does have real consequences for people. And so I think that's where maybe Bruce and I would come down and urge everybody to get involved in that profound way on all aspects of our political culture. Who was next? Was it Dan?
So I love Chloe's points, by the way, I just want to say that. I wanted to go off Robin's point first, and I thought that it was really interesting because older generations criticize their generation for social media, and as a rebuttal to when we criticize how they've handled other issues, they argue that they marched for civil rights when they were our age, right? But what happened? Because at least for LGBT rights, the same rights they claim to advocate in past generations are the same rights they're voting against, because they still haven't been changed, right? Nothing really changed. How can they claim or think they're progressive when in reality they're fighting against the very cause they claim to have fought for when our age, like the same cause that makes their generation great. And where do they get their information? Facebook. Fake news Facebook. Meanwhile, they criticize our generation and teach us not to believe everything we read. And it kind of seems like to me they might need to take their own advice. And then Professor Steinhorn earlier said, in response to Zach's point, that there would be chaos. And I'd like to offer this as a rebuttal. Our country was founded on chaos, revolution, fighting an oppressive power, and we glorify it. Then we give into and follow an oppressive system. They wanted to make Washington king, and he rejected it. Instead, he humbly built a massive city, that's the capital city, in his honor, with monuments built for him too. And now we glorify him and these founding fathers when he and they helped create systems that arbitrarily oppress people based on their identity. And I think it's just really important to acknowledge that, like, I totally agree with Zach's earlier point. Like, why are we giving into a system? Why are we following a system designed hundreds of years ago that oppresses people? It makes no sense. And I think that the first step, as Bruce said earlier, is voting November 3rd to maybe changing a system and making it better for other people.
even if voting doesn't always produce the results that you feel will accommodate or help those things along that you're talking about, because of the structure of the system is designed in a way that it does not always include the people who may be in the majority, as those numbers I showed earlier point out, which then goes to your point about, and others' points about needing fundamental change. All right, Zach, you have the last word on this, and I want to show you all something else.
I was just going to say, because I feel like a lot of people have been responding to what I was saying earlier, I just want to say that the critique that I'm leveraging against our country is not me saying to not go vote, right? I think as a Black man in America, like, there is not, voting has always been like a question of self-determination and freedom, with the recognition that those are incomplete truths or uncompromisable things that you have to do in order to sow the seeds of change, right? And so I say that not to say that, you know, we're living in an era now where people are like, oh, should I, you know, is our system really even worth it? Is our system? Of course. When you have people like Angela Davis saying that they're going to vote for Joe Biden just because, you know, she knows she has to, but because that is a better choice for the movements that she represents, the things that she has dedicated her whole life to me, that I think that signals to our generation that we have to be strategic. We have to be more organized, and we have to be more willing to work together to shake things up. Like, I don't think Donald Trump is the end-all be-all of racism in America. But I also understand that Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King Jr., so many of those other people were not the solution to racism, because we are still dealing with the problem that they dedicated their whole life's fight to, right? So I think that I'm saying, for me personally, if we can't come together and say, what is the vision that we want moving forward, then we are not doing our job as the people who are highly engaged and the people who are considered, you know, particular part of the electorate that is more equipped for that fight. And so I just want to like respond to everyone, you know, like, yeah, like, I don't want to say this because we're on the news, but like, you know, like, forget all that foolishness with our democracy. Like, you know, it's okay to be mad at it, and it's okay to be upset with it, and it's okay to understand the mass injustices it enables and still causes. But it is also important for us to say, well, we are the people with the power in order to make something different come up on the other side.
And your whole point about being strategic, you have to choose your battles and do things on parallel tracks to be able to accomplish change. I do want to just throw in one other thing here. And so let me skip over a couple of these slides and just go back to what the president said yesterday, because it does go to what our democracy is all about. This is what President Trump said yesterday at his news briefing.
Right here, Mr. President, real quickly, win, lose, or draw in this election, will you commit here today for a peaceful transferal of power after the election? And there has been rioting in Louisville, there's been rioting in many cities across this country, red and your so-called red and blue states. Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
But people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
The second question is, will you...
Please go ahead.
So this has caused a shiver among many people in terms of what he said. We'll get rid of the ballots and we'll have a peaceful transfer. Is this just the president keeping people off balance, keeping the attention on him, rousing his base? Or is this something more serious, what he's saying? And this follows upon an article in The Atlantic that was posted yesterday by Barton Gellman. And the title of this article is "The Election That Could Break America." And he brings up a point based on his research about electors, we're accustomed to electors being chosen by popular vote, but nothing in the Constitution says it has to be that way. Article 2 provides that each state shall appoint electors, quote, in such manner as the legislature therefore may direct. And the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore said that a state, quote, can take back the power to appoint electors. And what Gelman says is Trump may test this. According to sources in the Republican Party at the state and national levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass election results and appoint loyal electors in battleground states where Republicans hold the legislative majority. With a justification based on claims of rampant fraud, Trump would ask state legislators to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly. The longer Trump succeeds in keeping the vote count in doubt, the more pressure legislators will feel to act before the safe harbor deadline expires. Trump campaign legal advisor I spoke with told me the push to appoint electors would be framed in terms of protecting the people's will. So, is this just the president keeping everyone off balance, or is this something really serious, or is this just the liberal media taking something the president said and taking an article by a journalist at The Atlantic and making a big deal out of it, when in fact there will be, in all likelihood, a peaceful transfer of power? Is this something to be worried about, or is this something that the media are just blowing out of proportion? So I see Maddie, Jeff, and Andrea up there.
Yeah, I would say most importantly, this messaging-wise is consistent. He's sort of been saying throughout his campaign, I believe also in 2016, that he would have to wait and see what happened before he would accept the results of an election. So I think messaging-wise, that's consistent. I think it's something that appeals to his base. He's sort of this candidate who is an outsider, who doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks, what the rules technically should be. And I think that it works with his base. It shows that he's going to fight for their voices, and I think that that may benefit him. I think that what is a concern that goes beyond messaging is the fact that we're also dealing with mail-in balloting this election cycle, and I think that that is putting a lot of doubt in people's minds on both sides of the aisle as to how voting is going to work and the actual accuracy of voting this year. And I think that's where we might see problems of something that's a bit more concerning.
That could then lead to what Gelman is talking about, arguably, which this would go to state legislators who would then certify their own electoral votes, which could lead to any number of consequences. I think Jeff and then Andrea.
I mean, yeah, of course it's concerning to hear when a president says something like that, but, you know, it's also Trump. So how much can we take what he says as fact? By all accounts, he doesn't like the job from what I've heard, and I personally think, just based on what I've been hearing, I think he's sick of it, and kind of, if he loses, he's going to put on a show because he's Mr. Showman, but I think eventually he's just going to, I don't know that he wants to win, you know, but just the fact that he's saying something like that, we all should be concerned, and I think the people with the power to do something about it should be looking at all contingencies for him trying to, you know, rig the results, even though he claims he's so against rigging, and, you know, the elections have been rigged for the longest time, as long as they're against him, while he's doing everything he can to discredit mail-in ballots and, you know, potentially who knows what's going to happen after November 3rd. I mean, in all likelihood, there is going to be a peaceful transfer of power, but it's still something we need to look into.
So it's just possible he's just saving face in case the polls turn out to be accurate. And
it's Trump, who knows? You know, I think that's what most of us would like to believe, but it's Trump.
And the flip side of that is what we talked about earlier in this class today, is does power overwhelm process and the desire to people to keep power? But again, that's what that Atlantic article was talking about and arguing. Andrea.
I would love to believe what Jeff said and think that it's just going to be a smooth transition and that he's just putting it on for face. But I think that it is, as Maddie pointed out, extremely important that this is a consistent message that he has been sending. And what Dan had said, if it's a contested, in the chat, if it's a contested election, there might be, you know, it could eventually lead into the Supreme Court, and if he gets his nomination, what does that mean? Also, we have, or at least I personally have come to expect nothing from Donald Trump. He has lied, he omits information that he knows, he exaggerates the truth. There is no right or wrong with this man. He has no morals, no ethics, it doesn't matter. And he might very well be saying it just for show, and again, I hope that it's that, but I unfortunately don't believe that this is an empty threat, and I think that he would do something to keep his position of power, just because he is that involved in his own head, just of believing himself that he does have this power and of wanting to continue the things that he's doing. I don't think it's an empty threat.
So we're going to close up right now, and I'm going to just say a couple words and see if Bruce has any final thoughts. We didn't even get to a discussion of what the debate might be like next week, and the debate is next Tuesday. So please pay attention to the debate and be prepared next week to talk about what this debate is all about. But I do think that what we touched upon here are some big and larger issues that this election is laying bare about our democracy, about empowerment, about your generation and how you feel about the future and whether you feel that your voices will or may be heard, about the sort of dynamic between principle and idealism on the one hand and the acquisition and maintenance of power on the other hand, and how it plays out in an election, how it plays out on the third branch of government, an equal branch, the Supreme Court. And these are all very, very big issues that we all have to confront in some fundamental ways. Never in my lifetime did I expect a president, regardless of what you think about that president, talking about perhaps not accepting a peaceful transfer of power. Bruce, I don't know if you remember this, but never in my lifetime did I ever hear a president even talk about this. Richard Nixon may have imagined it in his tapes and talked about it in private. But I never can recall anything like what the president said yesterday. Again, I would like to believe it's about saving face. It's about just keeping people off balance. It's about making this, sort of driving the news narrative for another day, and about the defiance that you were talking about that's part of his political persona that makes his base so happy, which is that they're sticking it to the establishment because they have somebody who is going to poke his thumb in the eye of the people that they perceive to have power. But I do think we're at this very fascinating moment in our democracy, and I am thrilled that we were able to engage it at that level in the context of this election and how it plays out, and the third branch of government, the Supreme Court, because these are issues that aren't only affecting us today and in the weeks ahead with the 40 days left in the election, but they are issues that are going to affect you for the rest of your lives in particular, and certainly Bruce and me for the rest of our lives. We will talk more hard politics next week in terms of the debate. I had some fun clips to show you. If next Wednesday we have time, I'll show them to you then, of previous debates. But I want to see if, Bruce, you have any final thoughts on this as we close up our time today.
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. I'm going to make two quick points in terms of Donald Trump and what he's saying about an outcome and challenging an outcome. He reminds me of the Donald Trump of 2016. He doesn't sound like he's confident that he can win, okay? And so I think he's just setting the stage for how he gets out. And it's going to be, look at what they did to me. It's not going to be anything like, look at what I've done. I think he's going to be surprised if he wins, okay? Whether or not he's going to refuse to go, who knows? Let's see how that plays out. If it's close, and then it goes to the Supreme Court, wow, this is a totally different story. He's got the majority there, and we've seen what can happen when the majority vote goes to the Supreme Court, and what the court can decide. So I wouldn't bet against him if this gets to the court. I'm going to say one thing, because this is what I'm looking for next, and it's going to be incredible television. The ratings are going to go through the roof. The first debate. I personally think it's more important to Joe Biden, especially among young people like yourselves. I don't think you're Joe Biden fans, and why would you be, okay? You've said old people more than once, and he's as old can be. So I think it's important for him to reach out to you guys. I think Joe Biden has got to show that he can be a fighter, and what is he willing to fight for. In terms of theatrics, this is going to be really interesting. Donald Trump's going to show up without a mask, okay? That's huge, okay? But why would he wear a mask? He hasn't been wearing one. Joe Biden will show up with a mask. What's that going to look like? Will Donald Trump move over into Joe Biden's space without a mask? And how would Joe Biden react? This may seem like small stuff to you, but trust me, some people will ride with this. This will be the headline, and I'm just anxious to see how the theatrics plays out. Both sides are really going to think about this, and they're already talking about it in their prep work for these debates.
So actually, Bruce, you bring that up. I'll show you all one more thing, if you don't mind. Let me do this. Hold on. Let me go down to something, because it's sort of, Bruce, what you...
Can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me get... All right, I'm going to show you all one more thing, all right? So let me just do this. And Bruce, you're talking about crowding Hillary Clinton's space. This was from the debate in 2016. Whoops, hold on. Let me get this right. Sorry, folks. All right, so this is from the, let me keep sharing my other screen. So I'll try it one more time, and if it doesn't work, you
know now, I'm talking about when Trump walked right up to her, right?
Yes.
What he was trying to do is make her seem small at that point. He was trying to intimidate her.
Yeah, I can't so just bear with me a sec, because this is sort of interesting. Let me get rid of this Atlantic article and see if I can do that. Bear with me a sec, folks. And if it doesn't work, I'll just show you all. All right, so hold on a sec. Let me do this, and this will be quick. All right, and that's sharing screen now. All right, got it. This is what happened in 2016. This was Donald Trump stalking Hillary Clinton at the debate. Notice what he was doing. He was basically in the camera the whole time, dominating the visual because he understood the power of the camera.
Including saying, look, yeah, I believe because of, I'm going to fix it. Because I agree with, when the Affordable Care Act passed, premiums have gotten too high, co-pays, deductibles, prescription drug costs. It wasn't just that 20 million people got it. And like I say, 20 million people now have health insurance.
So, Bruce, that's exactly what you were talking about from the 2016 debate. Do not underestimate Donald Trump's ability to dominate the camera, the visual image, and if I were on the Joe Biden team, I would be thinking seriously about how to deal with the power of the visual image. Bruce, you're a TV guy. You know the power of the visual image. You know how important it is. You know it's often more important than what somebody says. And I have plenty of examples in those clips to show all of you, maybe next Wednesday, about how the visual overwhelms the verbal and the words that people say. But yes, as we go into next week in the debates, expect a show, expect record audiences, and expect record impact. And if Joe Biden is somehow able to pull this off, that will be, I think, one of the most consequential presidential debates in American political history. But if he's not able to pull it off, it will if he comes off as a sort of the way he did in some of those Democratic debates, one can argue that this becomes Donald Trump's election to lose. Bruce, final thoughts?
Well, and Joe Biden's going to have to own it. Now, having said all that, keep in mind also, Barack Obama didn't do well in his first debate. He was the incumbent against Mitt Romney, but he came back the second time, and got a TKO. So you can come back, but this is important for Joe Biden. Well, it's also important for President Trump, but really important, I think, for Joe Biden. If Joe Biden comes out incredibly strong, he may deliver the kind of blow that the president can't recover from. If you look at the president's funding right now, where his money's drying up, he doesn't have the funds. He's not in the places you might expect him to be. He's spending all of his time in the swing states, as he should. But it's really going to be interesting. Everything is about this first debate. And again, I think it's more important to Joe Biden.
All right, and just final question, show of hands. How many of you think Joe Biden will perform well in the debate? How many? So a lot of semis. How many of you think Joe Biden will not perform well in the debate? So a couple semis here. So the odds are from you all that is that Joe Biden is going to come off at least reasonably well in this debate. I would tend to agree with you, but again, you just never know. And that sets us up for next week. So we are way out of time here, and I appreciate all of your time and energy and thoughts. Next week we will talk about the debate and be ready to analyze the impact not only on this election, but as we talked about today, on our democracy and our future. So thanks everyone. You're great. I appreciate it. Stay tuned for Bruce's show tonight and see what Bruce is able to come up with in terms of boiling our conversation down into his show. So
you guys are great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks everyone. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.